Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The race towards Election Day, an economic development overhaul, and more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, President and Executive Editor of the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us. I am joined tonight by Karanja Janaku, Editor of the New Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
My pleasure.
Along with Bill Dries, reporter with the Daily Memphian. Well, I'll start with you, Bill. I mean, we have a whole lot of really tight races and races that are getting a lot of attention, particularly for a midterm, off-cycle election. You want to start maybe with voter turnout to this point, or do we start with the 4 lawsuits, and then we'll break down the various races and the various initiatives, but maybe a little backdrop on where early voting is and some of the lawsuits, and we'll get Karanja in.
Well, let's start with the voter turnout, because that's kind of the big overarching story at this point. As this program airs, early voting has ended. As we're taping this show, it is the last day of early voting, so we don't know the final number yet, but we do know that the early vote for this midterm election had already exceeded the total early voting turnout for this same election cycle in 2014 and 2010. Not as big an early voting turnout as in the 2016 presidential general election, about 40,000 fewer as we're taping on the program. But nevertheless, evidence of a big voter mobilization on both sides and statewide going into this election. Yeah,
and Karanja, your thoughts again on the turnout so far and the kind of energy or attention that the election is getting, and then maybe into the lawsuits.
Well, on the broader scale, obviously it's a great thing that we have such participation. I mean, it's a democratic republic, and as the people participate, so goes the deal. We've been seeing among certain quarters this heightened interest in getting people out to vote, and it made a difference in the earlier election, and so there's a lot of hope that there will be a similar type of turnout that will affect the November 6th election. There's been a lot of things that have been happening, that could affect that. We talked about the lawsuits and the court cases, but people like Earl Fisher and those are saying that they are staying the course relative to helping people do what they need to do to be able to vote when election day.
Yeah. Lawsuits, where do we stand?
We have had 4 of them so far, 3 of them filed before the early voting period even started. The latest one was involved voter registration forms. There were numerous voter registration projects here, even with about 80% of the city's voting age population already being registered to vote. We had numerous ones who were there, which also serves to promote voter turnout among those who are already registered to vote. The Election Commission said they were overwhelmed by this, and that they had a number of forms that were incomplete, couldn't be completed, but that they were trying to notify some people. So the Memphis branch of the NAACP and the Tennessee Black Voter Project went to Chancery Court, and the judge granted their request that the Election Commission work with them, provide lists to them so that they could help to contact the voters, and more importantly, to keep in place this process that the Election Commission has used during early voting, in which they've alphabetized as best they can all of the incomplete voter registration forms and have a central help desk. And if one of those voters comes in and says, I'm here to vote, they look them up on the poll book and they're not there, then they can say, let us call the help desk, see if your form is there, and in essence, re-register them to get ready to go. The judge ruled that would stay in place for Election Day. The Election Commission made an emergency appeal to the Tennessee Appeals Court, and the Tennessee Appeals Court said, no, if someone comes in like that on election day, they have to vote the provisional ballot under state law. They kept in place that the Election Commission had to notify all of the voters who had problems with their forms, but the rest of the ruling by Chancellor Jenkins, the appeals court said, no, that's no longer in place. So that was the latest. Before that, we had other suits about early voting, also aimed at election day as well, and provisions for that.
And let's stick with the one we just talked about in Crunch. I think you mentioned Pastor Earl Fisher, who's an activist and head of a church in Whitehaven, a New Abyssinian church, has been on the show once or twice. There's a lot of sensitivity of turnout, provisional ballots. Do they get counted? There's skepticism among some people that if you don't get a ballot that's counted on or before election day, that it won't be counted. And it's been interesting to watch social media that there is this kind of call to action of if you've had any difficulty anywhere being turned away from voting, they didn't have your name on file, turn to us, turn to someone. It's an interesting time about this sensitivity to allowing people to vote and then enabling and encouraging people to vote. Thoughts on that?
Well, people should take advantage of the options that are out there if there's any uncertainty about where to vote or if they can vote and things of that sort. Memphis NAACP and others have long been doing that, but you're right, there are newer groups that are making themselves available to do that. But back to this court thing for a second, that one of the things that struck me, I sat through the hearing as did you, and obviously Linda Phillips with the Election Commission said that they're already in the process of doing this notification. They will continue to do that, the judge's order notwithstanding. But when I was listening to the testimony, there just seemed to be a tone that I know that I and others found disturbing. I think Alexander Wardner asked her, the attorney for Memphis NAACP and the Tennessee Voter Project, are you concerned about these 4,000 to 6,000 people that are in this limbo? Are you concerned about that? And so she said, well, of course I'm concerned, But it was just the way that she answered that and the fact that it seemed to have to be brought out that just projects a tone to some people that the Election Commission just really isn't progressively concerned about people voting. And right or wrong, it can have a chilling effect. Now, these provisional ballots do concern people. I mean, the Election Commission says, look, every ballot will be counted. There is no fraud, but there is a sense among some people that there's something tainted about the provisional ballot and that it has a chilling effect on people exercising their right.
And we should point out that if you cast a provisional ballot, first of all, you don't vote on the touchscreen voting machines. They say, look, we're going to have to work this out later and figure out if you are a qualified voter. So mark this ballot, we will seal it in an envelope, and then a group of people meet after Election Day and look at it and look at your voter registration form, anything else surrounding your registration, and say, yes, this ballot should be counted or this person should not be counted. So the totals from the provisional ballots will not be in the unofficial election night totals. They will be in the audited results that the Election Commission then certifies.
And 4,000 to 6,000, I mean, on one hand, doesn't sound like a lot in an area of 1.2 million, but in truth, I mean, these elections at this local level, particularly in a year like this, can be decided by a very small number of votes. And so it'll be interesting to watch how that goes. And there was a poll, as we kind of go into breaking down some of the specific big issues or races, there was a poll, Signal, CYG, I can't pronounce that came out that said that just in terms of the level of interest statewide, that they asked people to rate their level of interest on 1 to 10, and 80% said there are 9 or 10 in terms of level of interest, which polling that confirms what we're talking about and seeing in terms of people getting out there. Let's talk, obviously for those who haven't been paying attention, they should have been, but they haven't been. The charter referendums, briefly, Bill, and where we stand on IRV and term limits.
Okay, these were two of the other court cases that were involved. First, there was one that in which the Save IRV group and several
IRV being instant runoff voting, which gets a little complicated, where it's a different kind of system of how you do runoffs if somebody isn't a clear winner, and it was approved by the council and approved by referendum, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, has never been used, and this is an effort, the critics will say, to get rid of it before it's ever been tried.
Right. The ballot question that you will be voting on this ballot would repeal instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting, which applies to the seven single-member district city council races. So the group Save IRV and several candidates first attempted to have a chancellor take all of these questions off the ballot, repealing instant runoff voting, doing away with the runoff provision in the city charter, and extending the term limits of the city council and the mayor from 2 consecutive terms to 3 consecutive terms. They wanted a chancellor to take all those off of the ballot. Chancellor Jim Kyle said, no, the time to challenge this is if and when these particular ballot questions are approved by voters, if they're approved by voters. So then we were back in court with the same group of plaintiffs also on this particular question about the matter of the city council approving $30,000 to $40,000 in city funding for what the council calls a public information campaign to tell people what's on the ballot, according to the council members. The critics who filed the lawsuit said this is a political piece that's going out in support of these referendums, and it should not be allowed. Again, Chancellor Jim Kyle said that's really premature.
They have the right to spend that money,
yes,
to authorize and spend that money.
Under city ordinances, under other provisions, and he said this issue too is not ripe.
Your thoughts, Karanja, when you saw the headline, or where you may have been there in council actually, when they voted to spend $30,000, $40,000 on what critics will say was an effort to get people to vote down IRV, and vote down the term limit referendum, which was in their self-interest. You had this public body passing, spending public money to support their self-interest and potentially extend their terms.
I wasn't in court at that time, but I did hear about it, and my first thought was that, thank God, there are people like Bill Drees and others of us whose job it is to keep an eye on what's going on. I mean, we just really have to turn up the juice as journalists in terms of being able to monitor what's going on. I mean, giving people the benefit of the doubt that they'll do the right thing. We've got to keep the spotlight on them to say, hey, is that really the right move to make? And it doesn't surprise me that they're making that move, and we'll see if it goes to court where it falls.
And I should say, we actually tried to invite city council members to come on to talk about it and talk about the decision. We weren't able to get more than one or two on one side of it on, so maybe down the road we'll be able to talk about that.
It was a very interesting discussion, even though it didn't, it wasn't directly on the ballot questions, but you had this whole discussion about with Alan Wade, the city council attorney, saying, well, look, the Save IRV folks are trying to monopolize the debate on this. He said absolutely the city council advocates for passage of these referendums, these ballot questions. It did that when it approved them to go on the ballot.
What is the money earmarked for?
The money is in the city council's budget. In the overall
how do they want to spend that $30,000 to $40,000?
Probably with direct mail pieces or pieces handed out at the polls, some kind of pamphlet or brochure.
And do we know if they've
or
spent
some
that
card.
Yet? We don't know. Okay.
Yeah, it might wind up showing up in the gap between early voting and election day. That seems the most logical
Can I
thing.
remember a time when that's happened before?
Oh, they've done it before in past decades. In fact, they did it. The council put out a public information campaign in 2008 for instant runoff voting when that question was on the ballot. Yes.
That's funny. Okay. I mean, it's really strange. I mean, it is very strange. And again, no one's saying that I'm not saying it's somehow, it's just a strange dynamic when you have people voting for their self-interest in such a way. Maybe we go into term limits also is on the referendum in terms that you mentioned that. Maybe we go to the suburbs. We have actually some competitive races potentially, or a lot of attention on the race in Germantown where Mike Palazzolo and Berziza, whose first name I've just forgotten,
Right.
Are running. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, this is kind of a continuation of what's become a pretty dominant feature of Germantown's political landscape. And that is you have, like the other suburban cities, Germantown has a school system that it runs and that it supports partially with city sales tax funding. So all of the suburbs now are relying on sales tax revenue to partially fund their school systems that they control. That means that development in some of these communities has become very controversial, especially in Germantown, which billed itself as a bedroom community for a lot of years. So you've had a turn in leadership which has said there is a way to balance residential and commercial development within Germantown. You have another group of people who've said that's not what we signed on for. We signed up to live in a bedroom community, and we not only don't like the increased commercial development, we don't like the apartment complex that prompted the city to put in place a moratorium.
Yeah, it is interesting, and you also have a lot of attention on race in Lakeland for Mayor White Bunker, who used to be on the county commission against Mark Cunningham. A lot of people would say that Lakeland, the real fight is about a high school, whether they want a high school, whether they want to spend it. And it is funny, Karanja, it reminds me of arguments when you start talking about the town councils or city councils of the suburbs beginning to argue about the spending on education and the capital improvements and how do we support education becomes this huge line item when you take that on, as the suburban communities took on when deconsolidation happened. And it reminds me of fights in the Memphis City Council or some decades ago about how we spend our money on education, and are we spending enough or are we not spending enough? And even back to when I was at my first job as a reporter in Connecticut, in little towns, that was the biggest fight. It was the fight between maybe the older people who said, I don't have kids, I don't want to spend so much in taxes on the schools, and the families coming to those towns who would say, no, I want computers and I want more spending and I want more teachers. That tension is interesting to play out.
It's interesting, but it brings to mind when you're talking about it that how important it is for us, no matter if you live in the city, if you live in the county, or wherever you live, you got to be an informed citizen. Okay, you got to do all that you can do to make sure that you're up to speed on which way do you go. When I worked at the Commercial Appeal, I used to cover Germantown and Collierville, and particularly Collierville and those places when they were sleepy, sort of little places like you're talking about. But even then, you could see the sort of the seeds of that conversation and contention about what is it that we're going to be in terms of this bedroom kind of community, and how do you balance what you were talking about there earlier. And so when you're talking about it now, it seems like it's just an evolution of what's going on. And the key to any evolutionary process like that is how well the people, no matter where they live, keep up with what's going on and vote the right people.
Yeah. And also interesting with Germantown, and we've had Mayor Palazzolo on, and prior to that Mayor Goldsworthy, and talking about Germantown being landlocked, essentially not having a big industrial base. Its tax base is residential, and whatever amount of office and retail it has, it doesn't have some of those other big sources of tax income. And again, with Lakeland, they've got that. Isn't the Lakeland Town Center? Do I have that right? I mean, big developments and those things come into question. And so it's interesting to see the way things going from sleepy suburban bedroom communities to Memphis to their own independent cities with their independent school districts and the kind of tensions that come up. Another local race, maybe talk about Brian Kelsey, state senator. 12 years now, maybe 14 years he's been in office, running against a kind of upstart campaign in Gabby Salinas. And Brian Kelsey has raised a huge amount of money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars that he's been able to raise, spending a lot of it. Some polls show Gabby Salinas quite a bit behind, but it speaks to this sort of strange year where can an upstart candidate on the Democratic side take down a more traditional Republican established state senator in what is traditionally a heavily Republican district.
Yes, it also speaks to the reorganization and reformation of the local Democratic Party. And one of the first things that the new Democratic Party in Shelby County did was to say, here's what we're going to do. We are going to have a candidate in every single legislative race that covers the Shelby delegation. That's 3 of the 5 state Senate seats that are on the ballot this time, and all 14 of the state House seats whose districts cover Shelby County. They said, we're going to have a candidate in everyone. We don't care what the odds are of our candidate, whether the district is 99% Republican, we are going to run a candidate in all of those races. That's quite a bit different, because before that, the incumbents, Republican and Democratic, really had kind of a gentleman's agreement with each other that you don't challenge our incumbents, we won't challenge your incumbents. That all changed with this, and the result is races like this, where you not only have the 2 parties going at it, you have a lot of money from the state parties coming in for this. Brian Kelsey, even back to his career in the state house, never adopted the philosophy that he was not going to take any challenger lightly. So some of this is a pattern on his part, but you've had Governor Bill Haslam come in and endorse Kelsey's reelection effort. You had Marlo Thomas of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital come in and do some door-to-door campaigning over the weekend with Salinas, who not only works at St. Jude but has been a patient at St. Jude as a child.
Yeah. Thoughts on this race? I saw you nodding. Thoughts on that race and that the Democratic Party sort of it's retooling itself over the last year or 2?
Well, the Gabby Salinas is just a really good story that I see resonated with a lot of different people. And it'll be interesting to see if that general interest in her story has some legs that will get people out to vote. We are also in that cycle where we're seeing just a lot more participation on the part of women throughout the country. And certainly in the South, and we'll see whether that can float her up toward the top. When we were covering the hearing a couple of weeks ago, well, really last week, about the voter registration form, I was just sort of talking to some of the Republicans that were in the audience, and even there was some acknowledgement that the Democratic Party that they're dealing with now is not the Democratic Party of just a couple of years ago, that they are feeling these stronger candidates. And I really heard some even direct support and acknowledgement for the job that Corey Strong is doing there.
The Democratic Shelby County. And I do remember, and I probably quoted this too often, but we had Corey Strong from the Democratic Party and Lee Mills, who at the time was head of the Republican Party, on. Still is, excuse me. Back in probably November of last year. It was right after the Roy Moore lost in Alabama. And I remember Lee Mills saying, look, we do have a bit of a Trump problem. I mean, we do, and with educated suburban women, Trump is not that popular. And we have to find a way. And his quote was, we need to divorce ourselves from Trump. Trump is obviously, President Trump is very popular among Republicans in Shelby County, but they, even back then, were recognizing a bit of a problem. We'll use that as a lead-in with just a couple minutes left to talk about the big statewide races for Senate and then for governor. On the governor side, the polls show Bill Lee, the Republican, seeming to really pull away from Carl Dean. Carl Dean, obviously, I think as we tape this, is actually in town campaigning, so I don't want to write anything off because it's, that's the way to look embarrassing and dumb. But Bill Lee is pulled away by 15 plus points in many of the polls.
Yes, and to be fair, his campaign's talking points include that as of late the polls may have tightened. So this is the kind of thing that goes on toward the end of campaigns. You have talking points, you have polls. And then you have what really happens on election day.
And the big one, again, just kind of rushing a little bit here, is that the Senate race with Bredesen and Marsha Blackburn, which is very tight. The signal poll I mentioned maybe has Blackburn a little bit ahead, but I don't know. Your thoughts on the first competitive Senate race in a long, long time in Tennessee?
I think that signal poll is a little bit Republican leaning, but even it shows it at like 6 point difference, 2% undecided, and another 4% margin of error. So it's right in that balance there. Thinking about Lee, though, his camp says that their numbers look different, and that it's down to single digits, and that for them it's holding their own in the rural areas and being able to show big in the urban areas, in particular Shelby County, which hence his presence here this weekend.
Yeah, we could talk more election, but again, just for the couple minutes left, Bill, maybe tee up where we are with this proposal for an economic development overhaul. This gets back to EDGE, the Economic Development Growth Engine. Oh, I can't believe I know that acronym now. That does pilots and other sort of incentives, and its relationship to the Chamber of Commerce, and who is selling the city, who's bringing businesses in, retaining businesses, and the relationship between those two entities has been in flux over the last 6 months, a year.
Right, and we had Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland on the show several weeks ago, and he said he has a plan that he is keeping under his hat, so to speak, as he talks and tries to build consensus around it. But some of the points that he talks about are showing up in what is the emerging plan from the city ad hoc group, and it includes some of the same points that the county ad hoc group is talking about. And it's basically that the discussion has moved beyond what should EDGE do and gone much further than that to say, whatever our effort is, it needs to be more comprehensive. It needs to focus on growing existing businesses. It needs to focus on a lot more research and a lot more drilling down to figure out what industries do we really want to go after for Memphis. Not what comes up on the horizon, but what do we really want here?
20 seconds, thoughts on this. The county is also doing a similar sort of task. Things you want to have seen or think you've heard that are of interest in this.
Well, certainly Mr. Strickland was talking about the importance of getting rid of silos and looking at this regional approach, and just reading the story that our reporter did and some of the people that were there, they're saying, well, who really is against that idea in large measure? But what they want to see is some real specifics about how do we go about growing our businesses, and just what is going to be the balance with some of the incentives and pilot programs that we use.
All right, we will leave it there. We'll do, I'm sure, a whole show on those proposals as they go forward. But that's all the time we have this week. Join us again next week. Good night.